Good morning, everybody, and welcome back, or welcome if this is the first time that you're here. My name's Douglas Field. I'm one of the organisers of this gathering. We're going to go straight in. We'll add a little bit of time for people to shake off hangovers and broken down buses, broken down planes, fire. You know, it's been quite dramatic. So just a couple of very brief details. If there is a fire, which I hope there won't be, exits are there and there. Lunch will be provided for you. If you have any allergies, then let one of us know, but everything is listed, the ingredients. The event is being filmed. If you don't wish to be filmed, then if you could let one of us know, we can put a sticker on you to indicate that you don't wish to be. This is a kind of fancy setup where it has this kind of any rustling. Thank you very much, Kaneta, for illustrating that. We'll be
giving a demonstration to help you.
Yeah, it was perfect. Picks it up, so it's kind of too clever for its own good, you know. So if you can be aware of that, that would be great. So I'm delighted to welcome our speakers today on this session, which is James Baldwin, which is the impact of Baldwin's artistry on artists and writers, which is, you know, a really strong theme, I think, which we picked up on yesterday as well. So beginning in the order of speakers, and what we're going to do is we're going to have, there are two presentations, and then we're going to have two conversations, and then we'll have questions at the end. So to begin with, Topher, who's there in the remarkable hoodie. Topher is an artist and filmmaker whose practice is dynamic, collaborative, interactive, and disruptive. He's dedicated his life to reframing dominant narratives to provoke new paradigms of thought inspired by Black queer aesthetics. And there are longer bios available, so you can read more about it. And then we're going to go on to Lydia here. Lydia Julien's artistic practice is gathered around expanded autobiographical narratives around race, restoration, work, labour, and culture, with participatory or collaborative interaction. Working as the engagement and outreach officer and senior archives officer at the London Borough of Hackney, she's passionate about preserving, documenting, and building a community cultural heritage. So really important. And then we are on to Johny Pitts, to my left. Johny is a self-taught artist who works with words and images. He's the author of Afropean Notes from the Black Europe 2019, which is on sale through the other room with wonderful Beacon Books, as are other books. So please do, burn Kindles, destroy Amazon, buy from Beacon Books, which is their new slogan, I think now. But please do support the wonderful selection of books there. Johny's work's been translated, this book, Afropean, into 9 languages. Award-winning book, and Johny's also, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a well-known photographer and his work, his writing photography has appeared in The Guardian, New York Times, British Journal of Photography, Condé Nast, amongst others. So also we'll get onto this, but Johny might be one of the few people here who met Baldwin. It's a little tease that we'll get onto later on. But you might be thinking, you know, he looks quite. Get onto that. If I said I'd met him, you would have been like, yeah, you probably did. You know? But I was 13 when Baldwin died. But clarified things, so it could have happened. And last but by no means least, Kadija George Sesay, who's a scholar, activist, an editor, and co-editor of this wonderful book, which we'll be talking about, Encounters with James Baldwin, a really wonderful publication, which is also on sale in books. So, without further ado, Topher, the floor is yours, and then we'll carry on with the presentation and the questions after.
Good morning, everybody. Hi. I'm gonna have to press buttons as I go along, so bear with me. I literally just got the system. I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes, I'm being told. Hopefully I'll be keep to that, so I don't hog all the time. And yeah, I kind of had I'm sure everybody did this when they were invited. How do you kind of think about how one kind of enters into this conversation, really? And I kind of think that the thing that I come in with is very much as an artist and creative lens, and also as a queer man of colour, a black man, particularly in this day and age. And so, like, I wanted to kind of just bring in that kind of artistic sense in terms of my meditation on the influence of Baldwin on artists and on myself particularly. So I called this, I haven't put the title up here, but I've called this Girl, Yes, My Love, which is kind of like a way of kind of imbuing both this kind of androgynous spirit, this kind of queer spirit of kind of reading, of showing up, and of joy. And so, as an artist, it's my job to deal with the imagination. So everything I'm going to be talking about, sort of things that people don't want to do or resist doing, is particularly from the academic point of view, I'm going to project, because the artist is all about projection and the conjuring up of things not seen. And Baldwin is kind of somebody who I think reflects the first template of a truly revolutionary black queer artist, and who has left artists like myself with a kind of a way of operating the world from a black queer perspective. And that kind of develops very much in terms of the way that he represents himself in different forms, in a polymathic way. I feel that, you know, if I was like born in the 1920s, I'd be hanging out in Harlem with him. I was like Baldwin, grew up as a poor black child. I also was a lay preacher at 15, 16 years of age. So I'd be looking at him, because he was the preacher's son, at the front pulpit, and I'd be eyeing him up. And he'd be very different in his persona. He'd be very slightly camp, he'd be smaller than me. And, you know, we probably got it together, you know what I'm saying? We would have hung out. So there are a lot of parallels I feel with Baldwin. Him being a preacher is obviously imbued a huge amount of the ways in which he has intervened as a narrator, but also in the way that he writes. But he also knew that he was different, and he knew that he had to negotiate his difference physically in a way that was probably very, very had lots of the stakes were quite high for him in some ways. Particularly because he had to negotiate the twin pillars of racism and homophobia, which can conspire to force those of us who find ourselves in that position into areas of self-destruction or violence or exploitation towards ourselves and others. We don't jump out of the womb as artists, and we don't just stand up and run fully formed as writers, painters, filmmakers, or sculptors. We discover this through how we play, how we interact with others, how we fuck. And Baldwin, as it's already mentioned, There Be Dragons, and Baldwin sort of was working out his place in the world in relation to how he himself was acted upon in the world. These men looked like cops, football players, soldiers, sailors, marines or bank presidents, admin, boxers, construction workers. They had wives, mistresses and children. I sometimes saw them in the book, sometimes saw them in other settings, as it were, the daytime. Sometimes they spoke to me, sometimes not, for anguish has many days and styles. If they found me when they were alone, they spoke to me very differently, frightening me, I must say, into a stunned and speechless paralysis. For when they were alone, they spoke very gently and wanted me to take them home and make love. He kind of speaking to and testifying to the ways in which queer men, particularly, or men who had sex with men, had to live in the shadows, had to kind of negotiate the corners, the bits in between. And he made very much aware that he was a target for those men. And that really made him think very much about the kinds of choices he had. And I thought about, in terms of art making, I thought about this work by Shelley, a portrait of Jason. I think Jason's probably contemporary 5-10 years of Baldwin. And I think about how Jason had to show up as a queer black man, and how his choice was to be a performative kind of entertaining kind of guest in high society in New York. And he himself became, dejected and drunk and alcoholic, and had to negotiate his way. I think Baldwin was kind of, knew that he was going to sort of, find himself in this kind of position. So he chose to leave. And I'm just sort of, this was me around sometime in the 80s. I kind of feel very much in the same way. I felt that I was also kind of a young black queer whose kind of physicality was one which invited being acted upon, and had to make certain choices about how I moved through the world, particularly as I looked like that. And I feel that Baldwin and I would have had a lot to say. And after we would have got out of each of his beds, whichever bed we wanted to choose to be in, he would have hot-footed it to Harlem, and I would have wondered about how he'd escaped and how he got out and how he got away, because I knew that he had something. I would have known he had something very special to offer, and he would know that himself, and he'd know that he had to get out, otherwise it was death and destruction. And that's all that. So it was really a kind of a very limited bandwidth, particularly in terms of black masculinities as well, because the idea of, we have all this language now of masculine presenting, feminine presenting, kind of both box us in and kind of create a way in which the world operates on us, particularly black men. And the idea that we are somehow hypersexual, we are naturally athletic, we're naturally this, we're naturally that in relation to the way that we move through the world. And I think Baldwin didn't have the language for that, but he kind of knew that he kind of sat within this kind of, he sat within a more disruptive space around his own masculinity in terms of those definitions, because he could see the hiding that those men had, and he could see the fact that from the preaching and all the sort of the stuff that he had in relation to his family and the enslaved kind of heritage, he knew that those two things were trapped. So he had to get out. And this notion of getting out was very, very important to him in terms of his creativity. And I think that's something that that kind of adds to him being very much a template for me as an artist and for many other people. So he hot-footed it to Harlem. This is obviously a depiction of Harlem by Isaac Julien in Looking for Langston, which kind of predates Baldwin, obviously. What I love about Baldwin also, because he kind of knew his legacy in some ways. He would have known of Langston Hughes. Obviously, he wrote in reference to slaying bigger icons like Richard Wright, we know that. But so he knew that he was writing within a tradition of black African-American writing, and he knew that he had a place that he wanted to take in that sort of tradition. But Harlem, basically going down to the village as well after that, and finding sort of a milieu of artists and jazz musicians and drug addicts and people who had more sort of, a sense of adventure and a sense of frustration, a sense of seeking, enabled him to sort of also think about how he might escape the country as well. I kind of was very interested in what happened once he got to Paris, and also we talk a lot about Go Tell It on the Mountain, the first novel, and I think Another Country was a very interesting novel, because it's the one in which Richard Wright commented after reading it. Perhaps what Baldwin was telling white Americans is, allow Negroes to sleep with your daughters, or we homos will sleep with you. And it was a Ralph Ellison who said this. And I think what he was kind of thinking about was a very kind of binary idea of sexuality, because Baldwin was presenting sexuality in a very unapologetic, non-hierarchical way, and more in the context of desire, the idea that we all desire somebody, and that desire should be a free desire. And he couldn't do that while he was in America. He had to do that while he was in Paris in some ways. And the homophobia, basically, that Ralph Ellison represented, and a lot of black culture, black literary culture represented, was something that he had to sort of liberate himself from. And it wasn't so much that he was declaring his own sexuality, and we've had conversations about that while we've been here. It's more that he was using sexuality as a territory for the discovery of freedom and the freedom of expression. and the idea that the category isn't important, but we should recognize the truth of our desire, and that in doing so, that is in itself a liberation. And I think that's something that positions him very much in terms of his sexuality, his desire for same-sex or opposite sex, but also kind of offers and invites us into the conversation about what true liberation is. And I think that's very interesting in terms of how he was portrayed, how he's portrayed sex, and the idea of what you do as an artist in terms of your audacity. And that's why I think he's very interesting for us as queer people, but also for us as artists, is that in writing about sex in such an upfront way, and all kinds of sex with sex that you pay for, sex that you accidentally stumble into, sex that borders on abuse. He was kind of having a conversation about things which were very much taboo, and I think that is something that audacity is something that I kind of really relate to, because audacity is not easy. Because when you wake up in the morning, you brush your teeth and you put your clothes on and you go about your business, there's an intention you need in order to kind of bring certain things into the world. And I think that Baldwin, through his work, shows us a template of what that might be and how that might come about. There's something about his exploration. I was interested. I want to show about Essex. We talked about Essex Hemphill, who's a writer, an African American writer who succumbed to the AIDS complications before his death. The poster on the left is him doing a gig in North London. He was also a lover of Ajamu X and Dennis Carney, and he's probably one of the first writers to sort of publicly engage with the lyricism that Baldwin allowed writers to work within. But I just wanted to show what his face was like, because he was made to know that he existed and what he was like. The fact that he followed in Baldwin's footsteps by coming here and also going into the continent as well. And obviously we have work like Moonlight, which was Terrell McCraney's work, which was a choral poem originally, but this notion of telling through the lyricism was something that Baldwin kind of really embodied and gave us, the artists, a lot of permission to do. He was probably one of the first people to do it so loudly, although we can talk about Langston Hughes, we can talk about Richard Wright, so I'm not kind of denying those kind of histories. And we can also talk about, the women, we can talk about Alice Walker, we can talk about, we can talk about Audre Lorde in terms of essay writing, we can talk about Chinua Achebe in terms of the politics. But the point is that Baldwin created a template for a lot of this work. That's what So you have the sexuality. This is a still from this Beale Street talk. Because I also think it's important that, and this is the first novel, as you probably know, where he centred black women and as the cornerstone of a community. So again, I'm not necessarily judging this notion of whether Baldwin was a misogynist or whether he was a feminist. I'm just demonstrating by the range of the work that he had, that he gave us, that he was able to embrace these different spaces of imagination, these different spaces of bold and audacious imagination, at a time when people like black women were not foreground or centred in novels in any way. I don't know if you know about this. This was something that was an exercise called Giovanni's Room Revisited. It was an article by Hilton Howells, photographs by John Edmonds and style by Carlos Nazario. And this notion of Giovanni being revisited, but David being black, was something that was kind of part of the argument of this essay that they worked together on. I kind of very interested in this because some people talk about Giovanni's Room in relation to race. Why did he choose white protagonists as opposed to black protagonists? There's lots of conversations, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't know. But I think my take is that he was kind of demonstrating the freedom of the artist. And the freedom of the artist is fundamental, really, and that's what I take away from it, that actually we can do this question of, what is black art, what is white art, what is queer art, becomes kind of, part of this whole conversation about Giovanni's Room. And I think that sort of audacity, that sort of the freedom of the artist is quite important. And I think this is something, that's the way I sort of read it. And this, unlike many people, many queer or LGBT people, Giovanni's Room was probably the first novel that they discovered around Baldwin. I discovered it around 18, and I didn't know who James Baldwin was at that time. You know, a really good old novel by some white geezer, and then discovered Baldwin out of that. But there was something about the lyricism that taught me something different about it. And then I was going back to the Paris thing with liberation and freedom. Baldwin. This is a film recently by Yashadi Owens, and it's called Jimmy, and it's literally hot off the press last year. And and what I love about it is it explores Baldwin as a discoverer of himself, as somebody who went to another land and found out that there was a different way of being. And it's very difficult for us in this day and age to understand what that might mean for African American. And because we can travel, we can get on planes, we can go places much more freely. But traveling itself was, a huge statement of a huge kind of disruptive statement, although he was obviously following in the tradition of many other African Americans. And he had the privilege of that being an African American, as opposed to someone, perhaps from my background, and of the Commonwealth. Descendant of British colonialism. He had that sort of privilege, but then that privilege gave him a lot of freedom. And what I was very interested in terms of his Harris and perhaps his Turkey life was just how he was able through that freedom to constantly find a truth in the writing that he decided to commit himself to. I guess the last thing I want to say is I think that. Jimmy had a queer consciousness as an artist, and he had to find a way to live truthfully through both his semi-autobiographical work, and he had to allow that consciousness to motivate his art. I think that's why Giovanni's out. And as Kevin Quinn said, what can queer consciousness teach us? I think as artists it's tough to work with fearlessness. I think Jimmy shows us it's possible. He's given us a template for standing up as ourselves. I think truth was something that he was very much interested in. The unexamined life wasn't worth living, and the idea that to be truthful through the imagination, through artistic creativity is something. But I also think there's something even more, some of my work that's influenced by filmmakers like Marlon Riggs and Isaac Julien, but also in terms of the lyricism of Baldwin. I also did a work for BBC drama called Facing Leicester Square, which is based on No Name on the Street and the idea of being seen and not seen. I did that with James. But there's also, I also did this piece called Quantum Baldwin, which is this other thing about Baldwin and how to see him as an artist. And it's kind of an idea that's introduced by, I'm sure some people have read it, by Michelle Wright in Physics of Blackness. And this notion that we look at, instead of looking at Baldwin as somebody who completes an idea, look at Baldwin in terms of the energy that he brings into the world. And when we talk about energy, we can talk about the quantum physics. And look, that's a whole kind of, I'm not a physicist, but to be sort of, try and simplify it, the quantum is an ever-shifting space where energy is expressed through particles. There's a kind of directness, like a bright light. So you've got this political writing, this kind of forcefulness, this kind of absoluteness, this kind of committed sort of energy that Baldwin had. But also it's a wave. It can be expressed through a wave, this energy, which is a kind of a breath, a kind of literally a wave, which is like wind and water. So you have this other sort of energy, which is more kind of open and discursive and soothing and loving at the same time. And that's the point. So these energies, this quantum notion kind of exists at the same time. And with this piece of work, I made a sort of a big theatre installation work, and it was really about how the quantum in Baldwin, the queer consciousness, is expressed through love, because love is the opening up. It is the place of full imagination, the place of full joy, the place of full pain, the place of full learning, and the place of full truth. And that we lean into love as the quantum, and then we become somebody who can somehow discover ourselves more truthfully. And that's a kind of legacy, really. I think it's also about him not wanting to be pinned down. We talked about it a little bit yesterday, the idea that he is this thing, that he is that thing. I see him more as a sort of a legacy that allows us to be queer artists, to be artists who have a methodology for moving through the world. That's it.
Thank you, Topher. That was wonderful. Lydia, are you okay? Was it like what you said?
Yeah.
Beautiful, yeah. I ran out just at the moment. I was scribbling. Beautiful. Sorry.
Hi everybody, it's really lovely to see you here today. So my name is Lydia Julien and I actually wear quite a few hats. As Douglas said, I work as an engagement and outreach officer for Hackney Libraries, but also a senior archives officer for Hackney Archives. And I'm also in training to be an arts psychotherapist. And I'll say a little bit later how all of these sort of connections sort of come together. And I also run an annual summit called the Global Kinship Conference, which is about community connection and kind of creating an intentional space for reflection, repair and restoration. And actually, I'm really glad I followed you, Topher. A lot of what I'm about to talk about really sort of dips into that in terms of that negotiation into spaces and trying to find yourself in spaces and how difficult and tricky that can be, and maybe having to relocate yourself elsewhere or finding spaces where you can embody your full subjectivity. So I was actually looking over so much of James, and I went backwards and forwards between pieces I had read years and new pieces that I'd sort of found in his archive in the New York Public Library, sort of selecting things that I wanted to sort of view virtually and read. And I actually found it really difficult. And I wanted to sort of narrow it down to a few pieces, but there's a whole landscape of his work. And I thought, okay, how do I actually tie it in? And some things that I might say in terms of his work might be untethered, but I think in my mind and my body, it is all connected. And I was sort of interested in short pieces of writing that really spoke to me, like In Search of a Majority, The Artist's Struggle for Identity. And I watched a lot of his interviews, and in some respects it was actually quite painful, in that it always seemed that he had to engage in this kind of combat, this friction, and to simply have a space of speaking and thoughts and activism in this resistance. It was incredibly agile, and it made me think about my own navigation in the world as a black body, as a black woman, and in that navigation and in that sort of constant transaction and also that friction. And that so often one encounters in just a myriad of spaces the donning and casting off of armour. So I wanted to have a conversation with him. I wanted to have a conversation with James Baldwin. And in some ways I did. We were sitting together, we were talking in this reimagining. And course it would be within a library space, because I know that would be comfortable for us. And for me and James, as I think of him, I knew it would be a comfortable, enlivening and enriching space. And so, in this reimagining, we got to discuss and reflect on how we both move through the world, its similarities and differences. So in the short piece that you wrote, in Mass Culture and the Creative Artist, Baldwin posits there is a division of labour in the world, as I see it, and the people have had quite enough reality to bear, simply getting through their lives, raising children, dealing with the eternal conundrums of birth, taxes and death. They do not do this with all of the wisdom, foresight or charity one might wish. Nevertheless, this is what they are always doing, and it is what the writer is always describing. And so I sit in this place of reimagining with, you know, in my world, with evidence, archival history and archival material. And we can look and think about James Baldwin in this photo here, the circumstances, how he came to be with this group of people in front of the CLR James Library with staff and some visitors. And I know a little bit about the traces of the memory of the people that were there, the circumstances, the condition that gave birth to this really wonderful and fertile photo. And I went back to what was actually happening in 1985. So this library, it's located on Dalston Lane, was renamed the CLR James Library to coincide with Hackney Council's anti-racist year. And while that renaming of the library after CLR James can be seen as it was part of like a broader initiative in the 1980s. Many London councils to incorporate Black history into its institutions, and the renaming also resulted from calls within the local community itself. So there was an incredible amount happening in Hackney, huge amount of activism, protest, resistance, and calls for justice. Justice and defence against police violence, harassment and brutality. And Baldwin knew that sense of injustice and being there with the community, fighting, thinking, and that call for activism and being together. And actually, I often say this in lots of talks and when hosting events and things. Sometimes the act of merely getting together, being with a group of people, debating, discussing, reflection, speaking, engagement, it's one of the greatest forms of activism by simply being in the room together. Because even that can be and has been surveilled and looked on with suspicion. Meeting together can be dangerous. So when Baldwin was walking down the streets in Hackney, maybe by bus, coming out of a car, coming to the library, which is now sort of moved and located down the road, just going in, talking to library users, to staff, and one of the people there is Mackenzie Frank, and he was Hackney's first African heritage community librarian. And it was an act of intent, and it was ordered to change and amplify the library collections in the borough to reflect the demographic of the community, because it wasn't there before, and there was a need and demand for it, and continues to be. And so I turned back to this specific piece of writing, mass culture and the creative artist, and what I take from it and who it speaks to. It speaks to myself as an artist. It speaks to another part of myself as an ordinary person going about finding spaces where I feel comfortable and able to be, where one isn't surveilled, one isn't under suspicion, a place where you can get not just what you need, but it's a space for enrichment. So even if that enrichment is sitting in a warm and comfortable space with other people, alongside other people, in sight of other people, and you don't necessarily have to directly engage with them, but it's an exchange that's going on physically and emotionally, non-verbally. So as you can sort of deduce, I always talk about libraries and the library, and I always talk about the library space. And like Baldwin, I've been going into library spaces for many, many years, and I was actually taken by my school. I was quite young. From then, it's been a real lifelong kind of love affair. I think because there's no other space in society where you can just walk in, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a transaction like a pub or a shop, for instance. And I've got like a little quote about what James Baldwin said about libraries. I went at least 3 or 4 times a week, and I read everything there. In every single book in that library, in some blind and instinctive way, I knew what was happening in those books was also happening around me. And I was trying to make a connection between those books and the life I saw and the life I lived. I think it's a space that you can simply walk in with your friends, your family, yourself and people. It's that space of transformation. Talking about like an instant transformation. I've been going to libraries for years, and I feel transformed by merely sitting there amongst the books and the collections and that I've encountered and I've read. I was able to acquire there. Because at various points I didn't have the money to buy all of the books that I wanted. I can buy a few of them now, but I don't have the space. So to have all those books, but I wanted to be able to access them. And the reading of people and the encapsulation of it. So in that encapsulation, that room, we talk, James Baldwin and I, and we're walking through those spaces as an artist and writer, writer and artist, a hive of activity, sanctuary and learning, just thriving across this landscape, Hackney and beyond, spaces and places of coming together, innovation, and the excitement of possibility is embedded within. And I think he would find it immensely comfortable. I can just imagine him sort of smiling, sitting, and I can imagine him thinking. It's in his writing, and kind of reflecting on the slowness, but also paradoxically the speed of change. Over the years, just going to close now. All that I was reading, I was struck by one thing. His works are deeply relevant, critical today. So glad that we're here in this space, because we're not looking at it in the past. We're not just looking at 1963, 64, 85, 83, where I've got some of these texts and resources that I was looking at. I was struck that his words have this constant agency, and his words have meaning today, now, critical, and have acute relevance. And I just want to close with a quote from him. I feel very strongly that this amorphous people are, and we're included in that, are in desperate search of something which will help them re-establish their connection with themselves. This can only begin to happen as truth begins to be told. We are in the middle of an immense metamorphosis here. A metamorphosis which will, it is devoutly to be hoped, rob us of our myths and give us our history, which will destroy our attitudes and give us back our personality. The mass culture, in the meantime, can only reflect our chaos. And perhaps we had better remember that this chaos contains life and a great transforming energy. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move on to talking to Johny to my left here, and then to Kadija, and then we'll have some questions at the end. And I'm really taken aback by those first two talks, really presentations, really moving, very poetic and lyrical. And it was striking that, hearing them, Johny, that we've had Baldwin in different spaces. Baldwin in that photograph of you, I mean, it was, wow, you looked 18. It was beautiful. It's the way it's shot as well. So we have Baldwin in the bedroom, Baldwin in the library, which is fantastic. And Johny, where did you first encounter? I did a little teaser at the beginning where I mentioned that you'd. Can I just shake your hand because it's yeah. Obviously you haven't washed it since you met Baldwin. So yeah, can you tell us how that happened?
Unfortunately, I washed it many times, right? and the reason why is because I didn't know that I'd met him until 2019,
Wow.
which is the year that my dad passed away. And as you know, sort of black dads do, it was kind of just this throwaway conversation towards the end of his life. As he was, my book had just come out, and he read it, and then he said, "Oh, you met James Baldwin." It's the first time he's ever brought that up, and how I met him, and as soon as he said it, I was very young. I'm an 80s baby, but as soon as he said it, I sort of a vision appeared of an old man, and I don't know if I'm making it up or if the vision is real, but like something appeared, and James Baldwin was a big was one of his good friends was a guy called Lon Saturn, who was in a musical with my dad, actually an Andrew Lloyd Webber musical called Starlight Express, which is quite an interesting place, right? Because you don't think of Andrew Lloyd Webber as any kind of radical, especially in kind of Thatcher's Britain, but Starlight Express was a really interesting space because at one point in the 1980s, it had more black actors. It hired more black actors than the rest of the West End combined. So Starlight Express was a super interesting place, and also the people that came through it. Jeffrey Daniels, who sort of was the first person to do the moonwalk before Michael Jackson, was the first Electra in Starlight Express. You had Michael Jackson himself was a fan and came through to the Apollo Victoria to see it sometimes. My dad was an understudy for Lon Saturn for the title role, and I remember this place. I was speaking to one of the actors who in Starlight Express, and he was sort of bringing back certain memories that I had. Because like I said, it's some of my earliest memories. And there's a place called the Westminster Suite, and it's where where Lon Saturn would have his it's like a little. They say that the Apollo Victoria is like a haunted space, but there was this little suite. I've got some photographs of it with sort of that kind of bamboo wallpaper that you used to get.
Love it.
Yeah, and that is the space in which I encountered Baldwin for the first time. My dad and Lon Saturn would often be in there talking, and James Baldwin, when it was in London, would often just pass through. I don't think he was interested in Starlight Express, but he would pass through and into that space.
That's great, and the way that you kind of told that, I hadn't thought about those connections with that. However, I do know, funny enough, that my late father was friends with Tim Rice, something that and I know that Tim Rice went to Paris with a mutual friend of my dad's and Tim Rice's to try and find Baldwin's hotel. So there's strangely a kind of Tim Rice, Andrew Lloyd Webber, which is not how I thought this would go. Yeah. But you never know. So I mean, that's something very special to, I guess, to kind of rethink and reframe your kind of relationship with Baldwin in a sense. It's not just someone that you encountered as a writer, but someone that you were in the presence with. And how was Baldwin shaped? And this is a leading question, I guess, but how has he shaped? Has he been someone that has influenced your artistic practice?
Oh, massively. He's one of the big figures in my creative life. I think what's the reason why I loved hearing this story from my dad is because it chimed with, I have all these sort of on the ground pieces of writing by people that I know, people like Carol Phillips, who was sort of on the ground during that time and was an adult and has all these sort of memories that chimed with kind of that space in the 1980s, and it's easy to forget that, Baldwin was sort of out of fashion really towards the end of his life and very worried about his legacy. But also just a kind of reminder that that he was somebody who entered various spaces. He would, I could have. It's weird you say about Andrew Lloyd Webber. I could imagine Baldwin, holding court with Andrew Lloyd Webber. And I think something that he opened up for me was a kind of map. He broke down the rules of kind of what a kind of working class black experience could be, and he looked out at the world. I remember a quote from Michael Eric Dyson, who talked about how the key thing is to be rooted in but not restricted by blackness. And I think Baldwin's a really good example of that, of how he was always concerned with black political movements. He was an activist, but he also sort of managed to, in a way that wasn't at all oblivious, free himself from this map that the world insisted. I remember, there's that famous quote by him, where he says, as soon as I was born, the world wanted to put like a sweeping up brush in my hand, and I realised from an early age that I had to defeat the world's intentions, and he did defeat the world's intentions, and which is why I'm specifically interested in his life, kind of outside of America, and with my dad being African American and moving over to Europe, a little bit later than Baldwin, around the same time as Baldwin made his second move, to the south of France. Of just thinking about people who managed to transcend this geography that they're born with, and kind of create solidarity, And that's the one thing I always found about Baldwin. He was a very generous man, even when he was writing about his enemies. I was in Loikabad recently, where he wrote Go Tell It on a Mountain, but also where he wrote Stranger in the Village. And even though it's a critique, there's a generosity and a love there, and I think that's what differentiated himself from so many writers is that he refused to reduce even his enemy, or he wouldn't even call it his enemy, I suppose. Like kind of white society, he refused to reduce that, you know, which makes his work so compelling.
Is that? I mean, one thing you said, Lukabad or Loesley Bow, which is. Did you go to the hot spring, the thermal springs there?
Yeah. It's very odd though, you know. There's all this kind of corruption, so it's not what I was expecting, because what happened is there was a corrupt. I won't go on a tangent, but there's a corrupt mayor in the 1980s. It's the only time a canton of Switzerland has been made bankrupt, and he had all this kind of money, and so when you go there, it's this weird postmodern. It feels like a sort of giant 90s leisure centre.
Like
you know,
Disney.
It's
a bit strange.
It's a really odd.
I got told that
different in Baldwin's day.
I got shouted at for where, because there's all these different kind of rooms supposed to be naked, and I just had my trunks, and I got shouted at by a woman saying, "Take your clothes off." And
That sounds about right.
yeah. Anyway, I'm digressing. One thing you mentioned at the time, towards the end of Baldwin's life, that he wasn't that well known, and because I'm a slightly nosy, noticed that you have a copy of Architectural Digest here, and is this the Baldwin issue?
It is, yeah. This is part of something that I draw from Baldwin and I consider like an African American tradition. Got this from a scholar called Chelsea Adewume, and she talks about how sometimes how in my family in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, there would always be this kind of saying where it said, "Oh, bring something to the party," but Chelsea sort of I guess theorised this idea of what does that mean to bring something to the party. You know, you bring something to the party and you bring a good vibe. That's one way, a good vibration. You wear an amazing outfit. You have an incredible anecdote. And so every time I'm invited to something like this, I want to bring something to the party. And it could be physical, it could be an energy. And so what I wanted to bring is my copy of the 1987 Architectural Digest, where they visit James Baldwin at his home in St Paul de Vence. But I think that idea of kind of bringing something to the party is also kind of, you know, the idea of the welcome table, and when you read somebody like Carol Phillips, his experience there, and everybody's experience, or Henry Louis Gates, that incredible story of him going with is it Josephine Baker, driving Josephine Baker to Baldwin's house, and Carol Phillips talks about how, you know, he's just there having a chat one evening, and randomly there's a knock on the door. He opens the door, and Jim said, "Oh, can you get that?" And it's Miles Davis. You know? But it's this sense of like a kind of somebody mentioned it, space, and how Baldwin was constantly doing that. But that notion of the welcome table as a kind of as an opening up for people from different places to come and especially I think at that time, you know, Harry Belafonte and stuff would visit. You know, you have it's the wake of the civil rights movement, where I often feel like they, in some ways they succeeded, but this is the Reagan era as well, and a lot of their thinking is sort of out of fashion. They won it on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think they're reflecting on where those victories had led them.
Just for a second, I mean, is everyone familiar with the welcome table as in Baldwin? So I imagine most people are, but I think there's a picture of it here, John. Is that right? There's a number of photographs.
Yeah.
So Baldwin's table in St Paul de Vence, which was amazing Provençal house that I broke into 10 years ago.
Around the time I did.
Yeah. And I got slightly told off for it, but we had this beautiful. I don't think it was actually, you know, physically that amazing, but in terms of huge table where people would gather and break bread together and drink, and shaded, and you had almond trees and it was I believe it's still in the physical table is still in nearby, you know, from the Baldwin's archive. I think the actual table, the Lost Archives of James Baldwin, the Radio 4 program, which if you haven't heard, do have a listen to.
Which is made by Carol's brother Tony as well.
Yes.
It's weird. I just cannot find this anywhere. It's ridiculous.
What do you know what's striking about this though? This particular issue, that Baldwin's not on the front cover. This is 1987, and he's not that prominent.
No,
so you could miss it. You could be I mean, I'm not an Architectural Digest reader, you know, particularly, but it's there's also in the same, yeah, you can see, yeah. There's an earlier, in the same edition, there's something about Bobby Kennedy's widow who's showing off her very patrician house, which looks a bit like a kind of mausoleum.
Yeah.
It's really patrician houses that it's like a country club, and then you've got Baldwin's here. It's really striking.
It is, and yeah, just that sense of normality,
Yeah.
and the idea of access as well. It was almost, I think, in the 80s, especially, anybody could access Baldwin, you know.
I don't have ice cream, but I can, you can get a sense of.
You can have a look at it as well. Please feel free, you know.
It around, Johnny, is that right?
Oh yeah.
Oh, it's-
Yeah, I want it back.
You can see the adverts are amazing. I mean, that watch, that Rolex, is one that I have, of course. There you go. It's yeah. I mean, it struck me that I
The year he died, that issue
Yes.
as well. Yeah.
and I mean, it's been going for a while. I mean, it has quite a big circulation, but it's not necessarily. I mean, it's fascinating the way that Baldwin kind of moved in terms of his in the 1980s, in terms of where he was being published, and presumably he was paid quite well. I mean, it was I don't know, but I think they probably pay. You know, it was and at that stage he was, you know, he was not obviously refusing these sorts of offers because was somewhat in decline. I mean,
And in debt as well. You know, like he didn't own that house. You know, that's the thing, isn't it? And the kind of complicated relationship he had with his landlady, and then how that complicated relationship continued on after his death, even. You know, like But no, for me, Baldwin is just somebody who opened up possibility. You know, like you know, there's I keep thinking of this notion by Walter Benjamin of a weak messianic power, and it's these histories that suggest alternative futures that are kind of always in danger of being lost. Even with someone like Baldwin, who I do think gets reduced, like the Harlem Renaissance, you know, there's an idea of who Baldwin is, but there are these sort of other things that are going on, and I think Carol Phillips belongs to that tradition. I think Langston Hughes belongs to it. I think Claude McKay belongs to it. Is these men, you know, there are photographs of Claude McKay in like Azerbaijan, you know, Claude McKay met Lenin. You know? Do you know what I mean? And it's like, you know,
Langston Hughes was in USSR.
Yeah.
Claude McKay was incredible as someone who was travelling around. I mean, the latest biography really tries to kind of straighten him, but he was queer and a really important, you know, and really importantly so, as someone who was, you know, travelled around. You know, Banjo which is a novel without a plot, you know, which is kind of quite hard to read, but it's exciting the way that he moves. In that sense.
And just like a little bit, you know, it's interesting when you look at the correspondence between like McKay and Du Bois at that time. I actually think, you know, you have sort of black intellectual inside the establishment making work, and then you have someone who's outside the establishment making work, and the correspondence is so critical of each other. I think there was a love there as well. But Baldwin for me was almost like a mix of the two, and I think it's true that, you know, if Baldwin would really comfortable in a library, you know, Baldwin's also comfortable in a bar. You know? Let's not forget that. You know, and that's and a naughty man. You know, like you know, I always think of something that you know, one of the heads of the Black Panther Party said about the men in the Black Panther Party. And it's strange to bring up the Black Panthers, I suppose, in relation to Baldwin, because they were so homophobic about him, actually. But this idea of that, you know, she said, you know, we didn't get these brothers from revolutionary heaven. You know? And that always sticks with me, because I think, like, we can flatten these heroes, but I get the feeling that, from what I hear, that Baldwin was a naughty man, you know, and not to genderize it, a naughty person. And these rebels, I think there's something beautiful about the kind
Excuse me, sorry, can you leave my things there, please?
Oh, I'm so sorry. We were wondering whose they were. Sorry. I'll find another seat.
I think just the smile, the kind of cheeky smile there.
And I just think, but that is so important. Like I worry about that now. Is like this kind of siphoning off of sort of the academic realm, and then kind of lumpen elements, you know. And I think Baldwin was one of those really key figures that could operate in both, and bring the sort of what was going on in the street and have a drink with anybody, you know, and then but was also part of a really rigorous intellectual tradition. And we need more of those people in society, because I feel like in this world at the moment there are these it's a real sort of capsular society, you know, and I think Baldwin managed to find a way to sort of navigate that, and I think it all fed into his work. It's why his work's so full and so complex and so powerful, is because it's human.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and this was really important when we were putting together this symposium, this gathering, that it wasn't just an academic conference. You know, Baldwin is far too complex, too exciting to be, you know, kind of pinned into any. And it's been any kind of category or any area, and this has been a kind of running theme. You know, it's been exciting to explore that. Kadija, I'm going to bring you in at this point, if I may, and then what we'll do, I'm going to talk to Kadija a little bit with some focus on her wonderful collection with Encounters with Baldwin, which I have Encounters with James Baldwin here, which is well, and then we'll kind of open up together as a kind of panel with the comments and reflections, and then we'll have some time for questions. If we run over a little bit today, that's because we started a little bit later, but it's fine. We'll kind of we'll make up the time. So we might run over a little bit, because I think there's quite a lot to say. But you know, firstly, congratulations on this.
Thank you.
And you know, as someone I've done some editing in my time, and I edit or co-edit a journal, James Baldwin Review, available in all good online sites, free. But I'm, you know, hats off to you, because I you know, trying to corral 32, 33. Not only, you know, you've got writers of different sorts, some more academic, you've got some creative writers, and have you got poets? I mean, trying to kind of get poets to be on time. I mean, with respect, poets who were punctilious. Yeah. But so tell me about how did it come about? What was the aim of this collection? I think it's a very vibrant, fresh collection. I was saying to you that having worked in Baldwin for nearly 30 years, obviously started when I was tiny, and that it's kind of high. I think, another collection, but actually, this is the aim of it.
Well, before we get on to that question, I've got to tell you one of the links in here. I'm sorry for you're talking about Starlight Express and meeting there. So did Rachel. That's where Rachel met Baldwin.
Well, Rachel, an incredible writer as well.
Yes,
so Rachel was good friends with my dad. And it's so interesting. I get to go through my childhood memories by speaking to Rachel and telling her, what you remember there, this is what was actually happening, you know? Yeah, what an amazing guy.
So he talks about meeting Baldwin and being blown away from him behind stage after Starlight Express. Yeah. And it seems like Baldwin was a little bit of a flirt. He said, "Oh, you were the star in the Starlight Express." Yeah. Well, he said that to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but it's just like, so interesting having links with so many people. I was just thinking about when George Schwartz said with your book, Doug, when he said the first page really hits you. With an anthology, the first page has got to really hit you. If it doesn't, people are like, what's this about? So one of the things was, I mean, it's just like I'd worked with the publisher, Cheryl Robson, and my first book that I edited, Plays for Black and Asian Women Writers, and she'd just called me up and she said, "Can you just send this around, please?" And I looked at it and I said, "Well, who's editing it?" I know that Stella Dadsey had done the intro, and once the whole book is together, I first of all thought, well, this is just a bio that Stella has done, and we could get the bio, but it's needed to read with the rest of the pieces, especially if you're not familiar with Baldwin, then everything goes together. You know, you read about Baldwin from what Stella's done, and then you read these separate pieces of people who've been impacted by his work. And Cheryl just kind of said to me, "Well, I'm doing it, but you can do it as well if you like." And I very stupidly, even though I was in the middle of 20 other things. But Deirdre knows I do these silly things. I co-authored a book with Deirdre and Joan Animado, this one. And in my final year of my PhD, she said, do you want to be part of this? And I thought, I'm doing the final year of my PhD. Of course. I said, yes. And one of the pieces that I contributed writing about if Beale Street could talk, because I felt in terms of if we're going to have Baldwin in this book, it has to be if Beale Street could talk, because to me that is one of the most beautiful, tragic love stories that there is. And it talks about black people, young black people in love. You know, we had to have it. So for me, so I knew when I said yes, okay. So, and I just knew that I knew a lot, worked with a lot of, you know, poets. And I was thinking specifically male at the time. But of course, wanted to have some women in it later. But I was thinking, who would write for this? Who am I going to write to who's just going to say, oh yeah, Kadija would do it without arguing with me? Because we had a short time. We had a very short time. I think Cheryl probably spoke to me around about January, February, and she's going, it's all got to be done by May. And I'm thinking, yeah, right. And but we did get a lot of it in by that time. And I just zoomed off to lots of people I knew and just said, please, this is what we're doing. Love you to contribute, blah, blah, blah. And it's going to be a short piece, etc., etc. And yeah, people either said, well, they basically said yes or no. Some people wanted to be in it, but it was too short for them. People like Courtney Newland is going, Kadija, how can you ask me this now? I need to be in that book, but I haven't got the time. I've got a deadline by then. And a lot of people, they've got deadlines. They've really got to weigh it up. And sometimes, and people look at them and say, well, why isn't so-and-so in there? And it's just because they're doing something else.
I think you did a remarkable, collaborative work, but remarkable job. What I also like about it is someone who edits work on Baldwin, and I have creative writing submissions, and sometimes I kind of bristle and I just think, oh no, I'm going to get I love Jimmy on it, you know, and something like that. And occasionally it's like that. And there have been some good submissions, but it's quite hard. You know, we talked about the influence of Baldwin, but then it's even harder, I think, when you're kind of writing, you know, under the influence.
That's right. It can be really hard, even without doing writing, you know, about somebody well known, and you don't want it to sound naff, and you don't want it to sound really lame. Or we've got 7 poetry contributions in there, and I think 1, 2, 3, 4 of them written specifically. Is it 4? 1, 2, 3, 4 were written specifically for that. Nice. And Roy McFarlane, some people might know, is a beautiful poet, and I knew that if I asked him, if I gave him enough time, and he wasn't even one of the first people I asked, just deliver something great and say, I just need a bit more time, I would. And he wrote it from the perspective of Baldwin hearing the news that first of all Edgar Medgar had been killed, and then Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So you kind of put yourself in his space as well, thinking these are 3 of his friends and 3 amazing leaders in America, and they're being killed, black men being killed. How on earth do you feel? And he puts himself in that space. Wow, how do you do that, Roy? You know, and I think Roy himself came from a background of his pastors. His father being a pastor, I think so. So that was just so really moving, and he captured it so well. But then there were other poets who I knew who were very much activists. I knew who would deliver something good, like Zita Holborn. And it was great because then, of course, we did want some women writers. And another poet I know in the States, because I edit a lot of anthologies, and I know other anthologists, but you kind of know each other. And Yuwori X Osayende, he's done things around, done anthologies, especially around victims of state violence. So, you know, what have you got for me? I thought he was going to write an essay. You know, some of those poems are quite long. So, and that's the other thing, is like talking with poets. It's like, I love this poem, but I really don't think that metaphor works, especially when they've already written the poem. And then you're going back and telling them, I'm sorry, but it doesn't work. But you've got to, in a way, say, I want the best of what I think is going to work in the book. You can have a dialogue, and it may very well stay the same, but at least you've voiced it and you've exchanged it. And you've also got to take it out of your head that this is not just me. This is going to be other people reading it. Will this work for other people reading about this subject matter? Because like you say, you want it to be varied. You want other people to engage in it. And it's not always going to be the way that you engage with it. But you want enough there for people to exchange and everything. So, yeah, I'm glad we had it would have been nice to have had more women in there, but it's interesting that all the women writing about their relationship with Baldwin's work, they wrote more theoretical pieces. Sonia Grant wrote about her space, like growing up in Pentecostal church, and her relationship with Baldwin, and then, basically taking time off from where she was working or something, coming up to London and going to see the play because she heard that Baldwin might be around, that kind of thing. So she said, so this was a big thing for somebody in the church when we were so embedded in the church, you don't go and play hooky. I did, because I wanted to meet Baldwin, so things like that. But other pieces were very, very theoretical. Again, we had to cut them a bit, which I didn't want to, but Michelle Yara Santwa wrote this fantastic piece about placing Baldwin in the Yoruba placing him as a messenger, Yoruba messenger, and I just thought to myself, how did she do this? But it was really good to see something so different, because we've all been talking these past couple of days that Baldwin as novelist, Baldwin as historian, Baldwin as philosopher, Baldwin as we don't talk about Baldwin as a film critic. Somebody was saying yesterday. So and then so placing Baldwin in this Yoruba mythology was something else. Another thing, and Baldwin as poet. We don't talk about Baldwin as poet. Whereas his poetry collection, I think, was the last one that Michael Joseph published, was in 1983, was a collection of poetry. Yes, me too. Yeah, and so, and it's got a fantastic introduction by Nikki Finney. And it's like all of his themes that he talks about in all of his other work, he does go through it in his poetry. But in poetry, it's more subtle.
Yeah, I noticed yesterday, I was on Spotify, putting on Shay Baldwin, which is the Baldwin playlist, which I'll put on again. I forgot to put it on this morning, through the next room. And there's an album that was made with the Belgian jazz vocalist David Links called The Lover's Question, and that's on Spotify. I've got it on a double CD. I don't actually have a CD player, but I've got the double anymore. I've got the double CD. But it was great to hear that. And the reason I'm mentioning that is, not everyone will know about that album, but also it's got a very haunting rendition of Baldwin singing "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," which is really it's spellbinding. And there's also some of his poems that he and I must confess here that I'm not a huge fan of Baldwin's poetry. I'm just going to put it out there. I'm think he. I'm going to stop there. I think before.
It's not hard hitting. But because you don't like his poetry that much, I'm going to read one of his. Well, this is one of my favourites. Imagination. Imagination creates the situation, and then the situation creates imagination. It may, of course, be the other way around. Columbus was discovered by what he found.
Oh.
Okay, I like that. I like the way you read it. Okay. Yeah, maybe if you could read a few more to me. We're on. Yeah. And then we are going to hear a poem which I also really like later. He is performing, and I really do like that poem. It's not that I don't like all of his poetry. It's just a whole.
Language in a way that you can't explore it in prose. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's what he uses it for, to explore themes. And Nikki Finney talks about that in terms of at the times when he went to poetry, at the times when he wrote to poetry, to maybe help him move on with some of his other pieces of work.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
absolutely. And why not? I mean, someone was talking about Baldwin as a polymath yesterday, and that's absolutely right.
Exactly, because
who could cut across different ways.
Cuts across it, and that's really difficult.
Can I just say something really quickly? I just noticed this picture of Baldwin with Buford Delaney, and about this unknown photographer, and you see them in Paris hanging out, and there's some really beautiful images. But the reason why I wanted to bring that up is because at the moment I went to the launch of it on Monday. There's a new exhibition that's opened up at the Centre Pompidou in Paris called Paris Noir, and it's the history of Black history of Paris, 1950 to the year 2000, and there are some extraordinary photographs of Baldwin. Baldwin's all over it,
okay.
and it's really worth going to Paris just to see it. It's amazing. And I think, especially for our purposes, it's been a bit controversial because I think, and I probably agree, that there's a bit too much focus, even though it's a French curator, a bit too much focus on African American presence in Paris. And you've got to be really careful because of the incredible, the negritude and Aimé Césaire and Fanon, name your
Algerian.
Yeah, exactly. And it's sometimes a way to deflect away from, but it's incredible. You have to go and see it. Yeah.
Because they had a week-long symposium of Baldwin, didn't they, in September? Paris.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
Intense stuff, yeah.
And there's a recent book that was published by University Press on Delaney. There was a conference a few years ago on Buford, as the Americans say. We say Beaufort, but Americans will say Buford. Delaney, who was remarkable. Dark Rapture, the one of several portraits of Baldwin, which is absolutely stunning. You can see it. You can get, if you Google it, it'll come up. Which is one of the few. Delaney didn't often paint nudes, and so it's an incredible picture of Baldwin. A portrait of Baldwin is about 16, and there's a real intimacy there. Delaney was around 40, Baldwin was around 16, both queer, both the son of preachers, and it's absolutely stunning that kind of moment.
It's funny that you mentioned that pronunciation difference as well, because somebody was getting wound up when I was saying Du Bois. I was like, that is how he said it though, but in France it should be Du Bois, right?
Yeah.
But they're sort of
Some African Americans get upset if you.
Yeah, if you said
I remember I was doing that when I was doing my research.
Yeah, it's. I'm always getting to get the wrong way around.
I wonder what they said when he moved to Ghana. I wonder if they called him Du Bois.
No idea. It's a good question. I mean, he's such a fascinating figure, kind of hovering there. So there was some talk of the Congress of African Writers and Artists at the Sorbonne in 55 that Baldwin writes about in Princes and Powers, and Du Bois was, his passport was, wasn't granted a passport, so couldn't go over. It's that kind of control.
Yeah.
Shall we open it up? I mean, there's so many fascinating comments, and I'd like to give people an opportunity in the audience to ask a question. Of course,
talking
please
about
do.
the first
Sorry, yes, please
really
do.
hitting.
Yes.
And so the first piece in here is by an older sister friend in New York, who I know, because in New York they still have salons. People will still have salons with artists and writers meeting. Where, like Baldwin, we were talking about, his big table, and in New York and stuff, they would have their salons. So where Rashida Ismaili Abu Bakr met Baldwin was at the house of the writer Paula Marshall, and she knew she was a student, and basically her the lecturer that she went with, who was being mentored by, was a really big figure. And even though he was blind, apparently he was also a big flirt with the women. The women loved him and would always want to escort him to these things. So that is where she kind of met Baldwin and Maya Angelou. So in terms of then having something hitting you in the face, we really wanted to say, okay, enter into this energy of meeting Baldwin. So I did it as an interview thing with her. Just talking about it, and you just imagine yourself in the salon room and just say, why don't we have salons, or why don't we still have them there? And you just imagine all these well-known people in New York all at Paula Marshall's house. She goes, oh yeah, she'd have them every now and then, and you'd hear about Maya Angelou coming and going, I hope you have my whiskey, do you know what I mean? And things like that. So it really, really needs to have that. So that's the one thing as well in terms of being an anthologist, because then the next person after that was Victor Adibawale, and so first of all he was first, but then I said to Rashida, do you mind if we put you as A first rather than I, because I wanted her first. It was more hard hitting, and that is really important. I think when you're doing an anthology, the first piece, but when you're putting together a poetry collection or something like that, or short story collection, your first pieces and your middle pieces and your end pieces should be kind of the strongest thing. It's hard to have everything great, but that's, you know, you've got to really kind of weigh things up. So that was our first page, the face thing, and it's a lovely, it's memories, her memories of Baldwin. She talks about meeting Nina, about going to visit Nina Simone as well in concert, and then Baldwin just turning up there as well, and everybody recognizing Baldwin. So, yeah.
No, it's a stunning opening, and you can really tell with this collection that it has been created and thought through in terms of the structure. It's not been one of the something thrown together. It's very much lovingly and thought.
Images in it as well. Yeah. Cheryl did a great job getting those photos as well. I didn't know it was going to.
Please do
Buy it.
buy it. Just another way to say it. So yeah, thank you, and thank you to all our panelists. Really thought-provoking. It's interesting how we put the people together, and the way that the sense of place has come up, which has been really evocative. Baldwin and bars. I felt a bit crass because Baldwin the bedroom fight. You think of that. The Baldwin Library is actually very beautiful. Very important. But I do. I've been to El Faro in Horatio Street, one of Baldwin's favourite bars, where he set a lot of Another Country, and I sat in his favourite seat and had my usual half pint of Johnny Walker Black Label, Blue Label if I was feeling flush, which is never the case. And it's quite magical to kind of do that. But so bars. But then think about libraries, and then all these different spaces.
I think that's where Fred Degar and David Dabudine and Kaz Phillips, when Fred Degar writes his piece, it's in the bar.
Yes.
After they've received the prize, it's in the bar, and then chatting to Baldwin.
It's about fermented drinks.
I wonder about Baldwin in the way that he had sex. The way he kind of found sex and joy and pleasure. And I think one of the things I'm very interested in is how the kind of ways in which Baldwin was able to show up with his sexuality as an agency, as opposed to a sexuality which was kind of put upon. I think there's something very interesting about that when we come to, as you were saying, about this notion of deification, and that actually there was a kind of a messiness and a joy within that. And I think that, it's a shame that we didn't get contact, because I would have written about that sort of side of it, because I think that is a disruptive space for kind of notions of what respectability is in terms of black artists and how we're supposed to show up. And I think that Baldwin as a sexual being is something that isn't necessarily talked about, but he talks a lot about sex in his work. And I think that is something that is, as in terms of queer culture, is a very disruptive place, particularly because it kind of really kind of contradicts and talks in opposition to ideas of kind of the ways in which we should show up as black people. And I think that's something very interesting. I think it speaks also a lot to his conversations in the work about truth, about sort of showing up truthfulness in the work that he does. And I think that is something that I kind of, in terms of my imagination space, kind of, the way that he went to Paris for sex. You know what I mean? He didn't just he went to find himself, and he had lots of affairs, and he went to Turkey for sex as well. So I think there's something that I find very kind of exciting about that, in terms of sex as an inspiration. You meet people, you make friends through sex, you fall out, you learn about love, you learn about yourself. So I think that's something that I was very interested in terms of him as a template artist, and that kind of, there's all these other kind of very wonderful literary things. There's a joy of the drinking. He's of that kind of generation, drinking, smoking, a bon vivant, the idea that he wrote while he was in parties. Taking up a desk, in the corner of a kitchen while people are, jazz was in the background and people are having it. And I kind of imagine he kind of slunk away and shagged and came back. And so I think that's something that's really interesting about.
You're making me think of an amazing, that amazing piece of writing by Jean Genet, where he talks about to find harmony and bad taste is the height of elegance. And I think that's it, isn't it, with Baldwin? Because he could take the messiness and present it in a way that was just beautiful,
The Genet I was thinking about earlier when you were talking about the Black Panthers, because although there was a lot of homophobia within the Black Panthers, there's a scene in White's biography of Genet, where Genet's taken too many Nambatals, kind of make sleepy and and less restrained. And he's with the Black Panthers, and he puts on a pink negligee and starts dancing. So there's a kind of moments of that, but then he also got Baldwin, who was sidelined. It was okay for Johny because he was white and French. There's that kind of distance.
Yeah.
But in terms of, do you know, Topher, I'm sure you do, but the Sedat Pakay's short film, because it made me think of that. So in the film that we saw yesterday with the Horace Ove, in terms of respectability, he's there in a smart jacket and a tie, and then in that you see him in his underwear.
In his underwear, yeah.
Which is really, but
because he was a church boy. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, going to church, you know, dressing up in a suit, the Sunday ritual. I mean, my father's African American. I didn't know that, but my memory of the Sunday ritual is that you present and you peacock the best of yourself within that space. But you know, even in today's society, you've got the Ruach Church on Brixton Hill, which is heavily populated by LGBTQ people, and there's this kind of joke that, you know, you go to church on Saturday night and you turn up at church on Sunday morning, and these different spaces require different ways. And I think, you know, there are ways in which again, I can only speculate, and in speculation it's quite an interesting thing, because just knowing what it was like to be a young, pretty kid, having people do things and want to do things to you, how you then decide how you're going to kind of turn that around and find the spaces to do it yourself. So Jimmy, probably in a very different context, in a very different place, would find that. And I think him in his underwear is part of that.
thank you. You know, it's a really striking.
A whole new picture of Baldwin. I just I'm now imagining walking around in underwear,
Yeah.
writing, you know, and just the exciting way of the way people were writing then.
Yeah.
You know, now we always think we have to get into a retreat, or we have to do this, or we have to do that. But just like we're just not free flowing, you know. Sometimes, do you know what I mean? We think maybe we're constricting ourselves sometimes as artists.
If you see Baldwin, the picture of Baldwin is in underwear, it looks pretty constricted. Got the white fronts. Do we have? Sorry about that. No filter on a Saturday, you know. Yeah, we have time for a few questions. Campbell.
I thank you very much for those really insightful and provocative interventions. I was really wanting to address the kind of homogenization of blackness as necessarily homophobic. I think it's such a dominant narrative that I find quite disturbing in a way. When we think of who's making all these laws, actually, is it black people? Just to think about that, but also I want to remind us, you can Google Huey P. Newton and see his thirst traps, actually, you know, to Topher's point about desire, and how desire is a kind of praxis for activism, actually, and how the Black Panthers used that to the maximum. Their uniforms were not just there to represent symbolism, but also around desire and black desire. Just to say that Huey P. Newton in 1970, and it's online, you can hear it, spoke about unity with, again, it was called GAY, the gay liberation movement and the feminist movement, and how that wasn't antithetical to the Black Panthers, actually, and he was one of the co-founders of the Black Panther. And two people from the United Kingdom, whose names escape me at the moment, were inspired by the Black Panther Party when they went to the meeting to form the gay liberation movement in the UK. So we have to be really careful when we homogenize that idea.
I'm not homogenising that. I'm
not
directly
saying
from Eldridge
you.
Cleaver, you know. Who
I'm not saying you, I'm just saying we have to be careful, because every time I look into our history, for instance, the Trinidad and Tobago flag was designed by Carlisle Chang, who was an open in the 60s. So, you know, it's like thinking, rethinking our own narratives outside of a white supremacist Christian framework, actually, all the time. I have to do that to myself. I'm not about any particular person, but I'm just looking at my own learning and how that is also framed by the necessary narrative of black homophobia and transphobia. So I just wanted to, say there is another narrative that becomes invisibilized because that becomes the dominant narrative. The ones who shout the loudest. That's it.
I think that's a thought to carry throughout the day in terms of when we're listening to things.
Yeah, I just want the sort of detail to add, and Johnny, you might want to come in here. It's absolutely right, and I think with the Panthers, he's absolutely right about that. With Hugh Newton, with whom Baldwin was friends, he helped organise the birthday. But then there's also to add. So Johnny started to mention the cleaver. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, the Soul and Ice, which is really kind of difficult to read in many ways. So Cleaver kind of borrows from Baldwin in terms of that writing tradition, in terms of the blending of the personal political, flips it round, attacks Baldwin in this really vicious homophobic diatribe. But also Cleaver also talks about how it was necessary to enact historical revenge by raping black women. First by making it in the ghetto, practices on them in the ghettos. So there's a whole kind of nexus of kind of
homophobia, which we have to connect together.
But then, no, absolutely, no. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. But then when Baldwin in No Name of the Street says that he basically says it's okay that Cleaver called me that. And what does he say? He said, in Cleaver's mind, I was associated with all those punks and sissies. That's the language that Baldwin uses. It's a language that even by that time the Black Panther Party had said we should be using. Anyway, so I'm just saying it is messy and complicated, which is I think one of the things that you're encouraging us to, think through this messiness and complexity, which is very useful.
What the Black Panthers did as well, for me, they're heroes of mine on the one hand as well. So it's not a complete sort of denouncement of the amazing work that they did.
I mean, what's interesting in terms of historical conversations around radical or not so radical movements around injustice, social justice, is that queer politics or queer thinking has embraced, from a black perspective, has embraced black kind of cultural rebellion. So even with BLM, founded by free queer women of color, and within my conversations over the last sort of 20 or 30 years, when we talk about our blackness, our queerness, the two are intermingled. But traditionally, it's not. I mean, not contradicting what you're saying, Campbell, but traditionally, black politics, if there's such a thing, has not embraced queerness in the same way. So I might show up to your event as a black artist or a black cultural thinker or a black playwright, but you're not showing up to my event as a queer person. And I think that's very interesting dynamic that I've experienced both in my lifetime and we see historically. So we do have to unpack these kind of strange lines that are drawn in the sky around what is acceptable politics and what is acceptable creativity for black queer people, or black queer people, or black people, whatever we put it. And of course, black feminism and women come into that as well in terms of showing up. And and there's a picture, and I'm just talking about my life in terms of how I've shown. There's a picture by Della Grace Volcano of me and Ajamu X, my kind of creative partner, when we were in our early 20s, in a white lesbian club, right? And I put it in an exhibition at Rukus Archive, the archive of black LGBTQ culture and history, because I wanted to show that is also part of the politics, that we show up for each other. And I think that's something that Jimmy gave to me in terms of my readings, that he was showing up. And this notion of showing up together, that collectivity, is something that's really powerful for me. I also want to say, it's interesting talking about the welcome table, because that idea of kind of invitation is something, when I talked earlier on about the queer consciousness, it's about the invitation. I think a lot of the misreading of queer consciousness. It is about absolutism. It's about sort of, identity politics that's kind of exclusive. It's about an invitation. And it's something, I mean, Judy Chicago's Dinner Table is a similar thing, both of which were influences for a sculpture I made that was displayed at Tate Modern. The idea that we gather around a space, that we come to a space, and in that space we find some kind of communion, and we actually have difference in that communion. And that's kind of really revolutionary. It's because the capitalists want us to be monolithic. The capitalists want to consume. The capitalists want us to be acted upon. And I think that's really exciting. And this is why I was a preacher.
You can hear it. Kind of listening to you as well about how not only do we have to kind of be careful that we kind of make sure that we don't do these categories, etc., and we're open through all the discussions, but we've got to be careful in terms of which location we're talking about. It's going to be different in different locations. I'm just thinking, because I do a lot of work in Africa, for example, and you've got to, each African country is different in the way that they're dealing with it, and we've got to be open and we've got to be careful the way we do that. Not only to embrace and share, the queerness that is coming from outside into Africa, but also to acknowledge it is very different, and you've got to take it step by step. But they want to get to the same space. We all want to get to the same space. We all want it to be open. But it's very, very different from country to country. And it's also very different historically as well, because people don't always realise that, and I think somebody was saying about this in the States and how it was years ago. But I know, especially in some West African countries, if you're going to a family event, even, for example, they'll be very open. People will be very openly queer people there, both men and women. And people always tend to think that, every African country is all homophobic. It isn't. And they just don't use the words. Exactly. It's just like they're part of our community, and we know that those are the boys who are like that. Sure. No, what's the issue? And they don't see it as an issue, but they won't necessarily name it. They don't want to name it or categorize it because they're just who they are. So I think we've got to kind of also think about that when we're talking as well, to keep it open. Because of course, in terms of, and I was talking like in Sierra Leone, we claim Baldwin because his sister married a Sierra Leonean. I have to put that in there. So as far as we're concerned, he's part of our family. He's part of our family. Yeah, and so many in Sierra Leone, it's so small. So many Sierra Leoneans. So, and everybody is so proud of that. They're very, very proud of that. The very fact that he was gay, that doesn't mean anything. They're just very proud of that connection, and they will always tell you.
Yeah, thank you. He's coming back a lot to what Campbell was saying yesterday about unnaming. I think seems to be the thinking through these complex themes. We have time for what we're going to do. I've just made a decision just now. I didn't think about it. I haven't thought this through. But we're gonna start the next session because I want a little bit of time to that, which is going to be Michael Rayburn and a reading by C. Sharp, the poet performer. So I'm sorry, it's more of me, but I'm going to be in conversation with Michael, who knew Baldwin, actually met Baldwin at the British book launch of. How well we planned this. Yeah. So I made this just decision now without consulting anyone. We're going to start back so we're due to start at 12 o'clock. Is that right? So we're going to start at 10 past 12 on the dot. Right. If you, I might even lock the doors if you're late. and then we'll, because we've got an hour for lunch, and we can kind of catch up. And lunch will be provided. It's free. It's going to be great. Hopefully the food was good yesterday. The falafel was a little bit dry, so hopefully that's my one. But it was good. It was free. It was in a bento box. It's okay. So we lunch again.
It was so lovely presented. We didn't.
Presented didn't matter. Any more? Do you have a final question or two? Yes, Nick.
I just wanted to bring it back to the second. First of all, thank you so much. It was a fantastic panel, and I very much enjoyed and learned quite a bit, in fact. I wanted to bring it back to the second speaker, and I'm so sorry for...
Lydia.
Thank you, Lydia. First of all, I really found your talk very engaging and moving, in fact. And back to this idea of naming. So I actually thought, in looking at this photograph that's still on the screen here, that you were at one point going to say or identify yourself in the photograph. So I kept looking, and I was like, is she this one or that one? You did speak about the gentleman who is from my right. Is there anything else about the other people in the photograph that you might want to comment about? Do you know who they were, what they did, and your sort of relationship to the photograph? Because it's quite a striking photograph.
I think with this particular photograph is that the people and how it came to be is still being unpacked.
Sorry, it's difficult to hear at the back.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
If you could speak out.
So the history of the photograph and in it is still being unpacked because where is she? The lady in the white dress I only met last year, and it was by complete chance. And she remembers bits because in some aspects it was just a working day, and in other aspects it takes on a great importance to somebody like me who's thinking, okay, what was he like, what was he doing, where's he going, and so forth. And different people in this photograph think about it differently as well, and how I approach them as well. So sometimes it's very organic, sometimes it's through other people, but what was really important, I think, for me is in terms of that I didn't want that history to be erased. I wanted to really start bringing it together and documenting it. But also for me, it was just a personal passion about I have an idea, and I know why Baldwin was here in Hackney, in London, in Britain at that time, but I wanted to really build a picture of it. So in not having that picture yet, I kind of reimagined what happened. And I was also just thinking about those spaces and Baldwin in his underwear, and which is a bit of a leap, but it actually comes back in terms of there is also the space of the home, there is also the space of the spaces that we live in, and the spaces of the front room as well, and that there might not have been a dearth of community halls or spaces for meetings, but people opened up their homes. So it was multiple welcome tables, in a sense, were around in Hackney, in London, all over. And that is where all of this sort of exchange, debate, commune, exchange, physical, metaphysical, emotional, was actually happening. Because as I go around and talk to people, that's what they talk about. Oh yes, he came over to my house and we were there till 2-3 o'clock in the morning, and I've got food, but met somebody, and so forth. And I think that space, homes, being invited in, because that's also something that's really, really important, that you felt invited. Just because you invite somebody doesn't, if you feel invited, that's actually a very different thing. And a kind of this energy and activity will happen, and I think lots of people here will know about people coming to their home, or you're going to somebody's home and tying it into what you say, Johny. Bring to the table.
I think him being here in the 80s and in somewhere like Hackney is so important. I mean, to me, it was just as important him in the 60s and going to the West Indian Centre and giving that great talk. This is so impactful, not just for Londoners at that really sensitive time of the 80s, but being in Hackney, that was just amazing, And so we had the event last year with the blue plaque. The streets were overflowing. You know, the garbage trucks were just stopping and just joining the people, and they were joining in with us. And thank goodness, but people like Layla Howe came and everything, and Margaret Busby was there. It was a real joyous occasion. It was like, for us, it was almost like, because I'm a Hackney person as well, it's like almost re-energising the fact that of how important Hackney is. Yeah. Hackney is not off the map, and him being there was really something. And remind us of all the other activists, like Andrea Enisu.
Yes.
I mean, there's
Yes,
more recent, but all of that was all mixed up with it. Because I can imagine. I mean, I know she's not in the picture, but I could almost imagine Andrea being in that photo. Yeah.
Just to, we should probably wrap it up. Just a quick point. Well, firstly, I was very sorry not to be there. It was on May the 17th of last year, the plaque, which was the day that I had a special birthday. The exact day.
Oh.
Yeah.
You
It
yourself
wasn't
had
my
a
40th either. so it was my. But it's had a wonderful occasion. And just the other thing, as you can tell from Johnny's Cockney accent, that it's. I just wanted to kind of put it out there that but it is Baldwin is very, very Hackney, as you mentioned. But just a reminder for those of you who weren't here, Baldwin went to Edinburgh. He went to Hull. I like to think he said, "I've been to Hull and back, and let me tell you, it was wonderful." I don't know if he did, but that's Louise Bourgeois. But yeah, so he is. It's a very, very important thing about him in this space. But I just wanted to kind of open it up. I live in West Yorkshire, but I just wanted to put it out that he went north as well. He made it to Yorkshire.
Oh, yeah.
We have photographic evidence. So yeah, we'll resume back. We've got a little break, so we'll come back in about 10 minutes. If that would. Let's go quarter buzz. Let's go wild. 12:15.